1 year has passed since the official announcement of 1D&D and when we received the first Dungeons & Arcanas, and throughout that time there has been a lot to talk about. There have been some incredible updates and there have been some not so incredible updates. Nevertheless, in this video, I want to talk about some history, the ups and downs, what we've learned throughout the process, and maybe a little bit of what we can expect from the game in the coming year. This isn't really meant to be a review of each UA so far, it's more meant to be an open discussion about the process, why it started, and some broad strokes discussion about shifting design philosophies from Wizards of the Coast, as well as shifting expectations stemming from the community. Despite the fact that they aren't calling it one, this will be the first time that many people will get to experience what ultimately amounts to an edition change in D&D. Honestly, I would venture to guess that probably the majority of people playing the game right now were not around for any of the game's transitions in the past. I do not say this as a bad thing or to gatekeep or anything like that at all though. In fact, I kinda see it as a good thing for some reasons that we will be getting to soon. 5th edition has absolutely exploded the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons, far more than I am sure the designers ever expected. What was a game for hobbyists and TTRPG players is now a massive empire generating billions of dollars annually, spanning the tabletop, movies, video games, merchandise, and so much more. For better or worse, Dungeons & Dragons has become a mainstream game. So with that mainstream success comes a need for improvement and refinement. Part of what made 5th edition so successful and so popular, aside from the proliferation of live streams like Critical Role, was the fact that it was, relatively speaking at least, fairly easy to get into, and this was not by accident either. The team has spoken on numerous occasions about the effort that they went to try and make the game as accessible as possible. They wanted D&D to be a game that anyone of any experience level could play, but that if you really wanted to, you could dive deep into the lore or the mechanics and really optimize and design your character exactly the way that you wanted to. So while on the face of it, these might sound like great goals, they definitely do have some real costs. Whether those costs are justified or not are really determined by your opinion of the game. Trying to make an update to a game that's accessible or simple on the surface level has the potential to make it so the more long-term and hardcore players might feel ignored or alienated, and that's a tough spot to put those players into. These are the people that largely kept the game alive and growing over decades, so it's quite the gamble to instead go ahead and chase something new rather than appease your current player base. A trend that continues to some extent at least to this day. Obviously, not every long-term D&D player would be necessarily dissatisfied with the direction that 5th edition took, but it was certainly a gamble nonetheless. The other aspect of making a game with the goal of putting simplicity first is where exactly do you draw the line? There isn't really a good answer to this question since everyone coming to the game will likely have varying levels of knowledge or experience in relation to it, and will also be looking for different levels of involvedness. Is it sufficient to make a few classes or subclasses that are designed for new players? Should all classes have a baseline of simplicity? Should all features under, say, 7th level be shorter and easier to parse? You can go on and on like this, coming up with all kinds of different thoughts on where you think the stopping point should be, but ultimately, it's at the design team's discretion to draw that line in the sand somewhere. But a big issue that we see is the inconsistency with which that line was drawn. While it's really easy to say that you're making a game that's simple on the surface, but complex and deep and satisfying underneath, the reality is that executing on that goal is orders of magnitude harder, and even more so when we consider the context of the Dungeons & Dragons team at the time when 5e came out. Both Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins have mentioned in the past about how much tighter things were a decade ago compared to now. Budgets were smaller and more rigid, the amount of contributors and people actively working on the game was significantly smaller, and it just didn't have even close to the amount of popularity that it does now, so the team didn't exactly have a lot of sway. It was simply a dramatically different situation than the team is in today, and that has undoubtedly led to a lot of the issues that many people have with the game now. The point is though that when you're designing a game with tight budgets and comparatively not that many contributors, many things can slip through the cracks, including elements of your core design. Things that were probably meant to be simple and clear just aren't. Things like the rules for jumping, for example. Wording that seems obvious to you when you know what the intent is might make sense, but then when they get into the hands of the public, they can quickly break down. This is part of why we've seen multiple erratas to the core rulebook since they were released, and why certain spells like Contagion have been reworded like 3 times. Mechanical interactions that make perfect sense to you as a designer, like Devil's Sight not granting dark vision or something, may also be sources of confusion at the table, and the reasons can often boil down to just a lack of QA, which makes sense when you consider the available resources at the time. I don't say any of this to excuse the mistakes that were made, but rather just to contextualize them. The point that I'm trying to make with all of this background is to highlight the alleged problems that 1D&D set out to solve, so we can actually figure out whether it's actually solving them or not. When 1D&D was first announced, it came with a bunch of vague and ambiguous statements about how this is the next evolution of D&D and that it's not a new edition, that it would be backwards compatible, and that it would encompass all aspects of Dungeons & Dragons, whether physical or digital, hence the moniker 1D&D. If you're enjoying this video so far, a sub to the channel would be amazing. I'm currently trying to hit a goal of 3,000 subscribers by the end of August, so any support would be incredible. Thank you all so much. When we received the first Unearthed Arcana, the Character Origins UA, it probably generated far more questions than it actually answered, which is something of an inherent flaw with this whole process. Something from an earlier UA might not make a lot of sense without the context of a future one. This is part of why the Expert Classes version of the Rogue felt so comparatively lackluster, since Weapon Masteries hadn't been published yet, but were always planned to be part of the class. Nevertheless, this began the whole playtest process, and what was clear was that the team was making an effort to really focus on clarity and functionality, which would in turn help everyone, but in particular, support the new player experience. Now, 5e took a lot of flack for its much more simplified approach to the game, and 1D&D is seemingly only doubling down on most of it, much to the chagrin of many playtesters. The thing is though, something that I think that it's really important to remember during this whole process is that us, the people who playtest or post on Reddit or make and comment on YouTube videos, we are very much the minority of players. We are not even close to the average representation of a Dungeons & Dragons player. At the time of writing, the 1D&D subreddit has fewer than 30,000 members, and the D&D Next subreddit has 750,000 members. That is over 20 times more, but even they are in the small minority of players. The things that we want and the things that we are looking for from the game might be very different than what the average player wants. There's absolutely going to be some amount of overlap, to be sure. I think it's safe to say that most of us would like more clarity and less ambiguity within the rules. But where you or I might want something with a little bit more teeth or some more nuanced and deep game systems, someone that plays once every 2 weeks or even only once a month might not want those things. And that is the incredibly complex web of desires that the team is trying to thread the needle through. I've mentioned this in a past video, but there's a quote that's been attributed to the creator of Pokemon, Satoshi Tajiri, though he almost certainly never actually said it. The quote reads, "You all think you have great ideas for Pokemon games, but if I actually listened to all of you and we combined all of your ideas into one game, it would be an unplayable monstrosity." I think about this a lot when I'm going through comments or scrolling through the subreddit. There are genuinely a lot of great ideas out there, but a lot of them don't necessarily work particularly well together, and that is where the game designers come into play. They are soliciting and taking feedback from us, the very vocal minority, and trying to transpose those ideas into functional and, more importantly, fun mechanics and ideas that will strike a reasonable balance between the dedicated fans and the casual players. I want to be clear that when I say a reasonable balance, I do not necessarily mean a perfect 50-50 split. That's not to say that what's good for the average player isn't good for the hardcore ones, or vice versa, but rather that there are concepts that just might favor one group over another, and I honestly take no issue with that. Despite a lot of uncertainty in the beginning about what exactly the team meant by backwards compatible, part of their design ethos that they have been quite consistent in since the beginning of this process is the want to allow characters to be the most true versions of themselves than they have ever since 5e began. Jeremy Crawford used to mention a lot in the early videos about allowing players to create the dwarfiest dwarf, by giving them active features that felt like they made contextual sense and felt like there were obvious oversights from 5e. They talked about wanting players to be able to create the roguiest rogue by having features that aligned with the class design, goals, and expressions, and through that we got things like Cunning Strike. This is certainly not to say that the team doesn't miss, they absolutely do, and I think the UA6 Monk and Ranger are great examples of that, but by the same token, the UA6 Bard is probably about as close to the bardiest bard that I can really think of. You can see elements of this thought process even in designs that ultimately flop during playtesting. Things like the Druid wild shape templates, which I'm definitely not still salty about. You might need to look for it, but it is there. The templates were an extension of the idea that they didn't want the Druid to just take on the form of some kind of beast like they would have if they were just using the standard stat blocks. Instead, they wanted the Druid themselves to actually become the beast and not be lost within. That's part of why there was so much carryover in terms of things like hit points and class features. You were becoming the beast, not just changing your form. The thing is though, that this idea of becoming the druidiest druid doesn't just extend to the mechanical adjustments in the game, but also extends to what people find fun. This experiment ultimately didn't resonate with the public and it wasn't found to be fun, which in my eyes is the single most important factor when considering whether a change is right for the game or not. This is another core element of 1D&D's design that I feel is often overlooked, and it feels like the team is, trying at least, to put fun at the forefront of the game for the majority of players. Races now all have active abilities like the Dwarf's new Tremor Sense. Weapon Masteries implemented a system allowing characters to use their weapons in new ways that always made logical sense, but they just weren't codified into the game. The new spell lists make it easier for certain classes and subclasses to know which spells apply to them, and allow for greater extensibility when it comes to future releases down the road. What all of these have in common is that they create new or simplify ways for players to interact with each other and their environment, while also simultaneously removing some of the onus from the Dungeon Master, who's already taken on just so much. Previously, if a player wanted to trip or push someone with their weapon, since there was no real accessible rule to it, outside of some things that are buried within the DMG, it would have been left up to the DM to come up with a solution that works for them and their table. This process, which can be unquestionably fun for so many people, is genuinely nightmare fuel for others. It can bog down play, create tension at the table, and put the DM into a position where they will need to make a call that could have farther reaching impacts than they realize. And of course, the weapon example is just one small microcosm of that whole experience. All of these updates that I mentioned, including those that I haven't and those that are still to come, were created to amplify fun at the table. They give players new things to do, which can create amazing and unexpected moments and also help relieve the DM of the need to make many of their own calls if that's something that they want to avoid. It's all about options. I think something that tends to happen frequently during discussions in these playtests is that many of us, including me, fall into the trap of equating power sometimes with fun. I want to be really clear that I'm in no way saying that doing powerful things isn't fun or that it can't be fun. It absolutely can, and honestly, should be. Doing crazy powerful, borderline broken things should feel fun because, after all, this is a game. What I am saying though is that one doesn't necessitate the other. Let's take an example. Most people would probably agree that if you had a character that had access to a button that if pushed would just instantly kill any and all enemies, that probably wouldn't be very much fun outside of the first time you use it, I guess. It is insanely powerful, but I can't see a world where a button like that is considered fun. It renders like 90% of the class features completely useless and kills an entire pillar of the game. On the flip side, there is literally nothing powerful about creating copious amounts of mayonnaise from a jug of alchemy, but damn, for some reason that is fun as hell. What's clear from the design team's messaging is that they are not putting a heavy emphasis on power right now, and I think at least for a good reason. Many of the discussions online about each UA focus so heavily on nerfs and buffs and get so bogged down in numbers and optimization that they often overlook other aspects of the game. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing either. It provides a potentially very useful context to evaluate, in a quantitative way at least, the changes that a feature has had. The thing is though, if say most things in the game end up getting 20% more powerful, is anything actually a buff at that point, or is the baseline power of the game just higher? It's effectively just the status quo. People have said before that all I want are nerfs to the game and for everything to hit some sort of mythical balance where every class functions exactly as well as every other class, and I honestly find that to be embarrassingly laughable considering how much I advocate for change, balancing up, and have made entire videos talking about why I don't think it makes sense for every class to be on perfectly equal footing. I think what these commenters forget about sometimes, and I don't blame them because I've absolutely done the same myself, is that not everything needs to be classified into these perfectly neat categories of being a nerf or a buff. Sometimes things are just changed. There is room for lateral movement, and whether that's better or worse, I guess, depends largely on the perspective that you look at it from. Let's take the example of the UA6 version of Favorite Enemy and compare it to the UA2 version. Pretty much everyone, including myself, called the UA6 version worse or a nerf or whatever, and while it is true that bumping the feature back to second level and adding concentration back into it made it worse in some respects, it's also not that hard to argue that by getting probably at least 4 free casts of it, it can be considered an improvement. Since you now have multiple free casts, it leaves you with many more available spell slots with which you can do other things, which does create indirect power. So from that perspective, it's not necessarily better or worse, it's just different. The point that I'm trying to make isn't really about Favorite Enemy specifically, but really just that it's so rarely as cut and dry as we want it to be. As humans, we just want things to fit perfectly into our neat little boxes, but the reality is that just oftentimes they don't. There's just so much more nuance to it than that. Ultimately, what Dungeons & Dragons is becoming with this next evolution of the game just probably isn't for everyone, or even everyone that played 5th edition for that matter, and that's okay. It might be disappointing, you might want to love D&D, but the decisions they're making just might not appeal to you anymore. The game has changed, and so have you. There's some really easy arguments to throw out that all the team is doing now is chasing money and growth, and that this whole 1D&D thing is just a drawn-out marketing campaign so they can sell more books, and sure, there might be an element of truth to that. I'm not naive enough to think that this whole thing is just a purely altruistic gesture to make the best game possible, but I'm also not cynical enough to think that it's just a pure money grab either. While on some level it might be marketing, they don't actually even promote it all that much. Even during the D&D Direct this year, where they discussed everything new, they never mentioned it once. That said though, any of us discussing it online, even things like this video, is some amount of free marketing, so I honestly do really enjoy 5th edition for what it is. I'm not saying that it's perfect or that it's the most mechanically deep or rich game in the world, but that's not really what I want from it either. The game has some many glaring issues, and it is certainly in need of refinement, and that's what 1D&D is seemingly attempting to offer. Yes, they want the game to generate revenue, but the best way to do that is by making a game that people enjoy and want to pay for. The team has already decided on what exactly it is that they want Dungeons & Dragons to be, and that is a game that is fairly easy to get into, offers some amount of depth, but isn't so complex that you feel like your sessions are spent working. The desire to maintain backwards compatibility, something that I've been extremely critical of in the past, is seemingly not going anywhere, and I've just accepted that it is part of the 1D&D package for better or worse. The last thing that I want to mention is somewhat related to that, but since we don't actually have all that much information on it, I won't spend a lot of time here. I want to quickly talk about the virtual tabletop. Wizards of the Coast wants you to spend all of your time with their products, obviously. They want you to buy their books, use D&D Beyond for digital copies or your character sheets, and they want you to play the game on their VTT, not Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or anything else. The common thing that gets thrown around in the community about their VTT is that the team is trying to simplify the game to make it easier for the coders of the virtual tabletop, and I really think that that idea is frankly a bit silly. There really just isn't any rules interaction that cannot be coded into the game. They're simplifying the game and certain rules because that's the direction that they're trying to go, not to make it easier for the VTT. I do, however, think that the virtual tabletop has much more to do with backwards compatibility though. When it launches, they want people to use it. They want people to transfer their campaigns over to it, and that would be a really hard sell if there was no content available for it. Having the entire backlog of 5th edition adventures and campaign settings available at launch would go a really long way to swaying people to their product. When I really think about it, 1D&D is shaping up to be exactly what the design team said from the beginning, the next evolution of D&D. It's not revolutionary, it's not completely overhauling entire systems and mechanics to fundamentally change the way that they work. It's an iteration to a system that they are generally happy with and that is finding a very large and growing audience. The risk to reward ratio for a brand new system is just not worth it when comparing it to one that is constantly growing and at a rapid rate every single day. You don't need to like 1D&D, it is absolutely not for everyone. From where I sit, and after a lot of thought, I am perfectly happy with the iterative evolution that the game is shaping up to be, even if I don't like every decision that they're making right now. But hey, I didn't like everything about 5e either, so I guess there's that. There's still a good amount of time left in the process to see even more refinement, and especially when we remember that the team has said that they will be offering playtest material for the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual as well, so we will get much more exposure to the development process than ever before, and that's something that I'm really looking forward to. Thanks so much for sticking around this long, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider subscribing to help me reach my goal of 3,000 subscribers by the end of August, but otherwise, take care.